At least 8 people were killed, 7 others injured from a shooting that happened over the weekend in Allen, Texas, at a mall. The shooter has been identified as Mauricio Garcia, who was killed on the scene. He was 33 years old. We don't know a lot yet as to motive, although he did have initials on his person that indicate he might have been a part of a white supremacist group. This has obviously caused a lot of politicization and controversy about whether or not he, as a Latino man, can be properly identified as a part of a white supremacist group. Others have pointed to the existence of Nick Fuentes and other prominent white Latinos as contrary evidence. But first and foremost, a tragedy. There's been an enormous amount of eyewitness accounting on the ground from people who intervened and tried to help. A mother apparently died trying to shield her child from bullets, successfully doing so. The child was recovered, covered in their parents' blood. Yeah,
sounds very, very grisly.
Horrific.
Someone's face was blown away.
A child's.
Very, really horrible. Horrible tragedy.
Yeah, so apparently what we do know about Garcia is that he was living in some temporary housing in Dallas, that he used to work as a security guard and had received firearms training for that position. He apparently worked from about 2016 to 2020 as a security guard, at which point his license expired. It's not clear why. You were not allowed to work as a security guard and have that license if you are convicted of a number of crimes, including assault, battery, spousal abuse, those kinds of things. Again, we don't know why it is that he lost his license, but people are trying to look to context for why there might have been that gap. And as I said earlier, he was living in a temporary housing unit, so it seemed like he was not in the best of situations leading up to his choice to victimize this community.
Right. We'll want to know, was there a law enforcement action that could have been taken? Does he have these weapons illegally then, if he's not supposed to be carrying them because he, wasn't able to anymore? What of that nature? All of those things. But it's another really awful mass shooting this year. I think we're up to 200 so far this year that meet the technical definition, which is that 4 people have to be shot other than the shooter.
And at this point, Robby, you make that point, and I think it's a very legitimate one to make, that many of what we characterize, the events that we characterize as mass shootings aren't the kind of random seeming sporadic events. They're more gang related and the like. However, I feel like even the two of us on this show have covered the more typical kinds of mass shootings, and they have been numerous. And so, of course, as a consequence, there's been this political battle that's emerged going back and forth. Greg Abbott made a statement pointing to California as having the largest number of gun victims, seeming to want to insulate Texas from critiques about its own gun laws.
California did have the biggest mass shooting so far this year, in Monterey. That was a... Hold on, I'm pulling up more details on that. I saw that one listed. 11 victims killed there earlier this year on January 21st at a ballroom dance studio.
Right. So in response, Gavin Newsom pushed back, saying that if you actually look at the gun death rate, as if you control for the population.
That's true. And again, that's so different because the mass shootings they get attention because obviously we're giving this attention. It's horrible. It's grisly. It's especially when they're random, children dying, etc. But the overwhelming majority of gun deaths are not somebody walking into a mall or school or something, but one-off gun crime in the house or with neighbors or crime, which is not to minimize or say that it's not bad.
But just to say, even if you control for the same types of gun deaths, that apparently in California, there are 9 gun deaths per 100,000 people. In Texas, it's 15.6%. So again,
not because of a difference in mass shootings, but a difference in
just pure gun deaths across the board. So how useful are these kind of numerical battles? Who has it worse? Who's doing it better? I think no one would contest that, of course, terrible gun crimes happen in places like California where there are more strict gun laws. It does seem like numerically it happens with a lower frequency. We spoke to Nancy Mace of South Carolina a few weeks ago here on the show, and she pointed to the large number of gun crimes that happen in northern blue cities like Chicago, of course, a state like South Carolina is one of the largest sources of guns for people in the bluer states where they do have stricter gun control laws. Chicago has a lot of issues with guns coming up through its southern border because of surrounding states having weaker gun laws as well. So, I mean, the blame game feels frustrating in a country where the fate of states are so closely linked to each other. And also, I think there's an exhaustion among the public that regardless of one's ideological priors, it is horrifying to feel increasingly like you could be going to the mall, going to church, going to school and feel so unsafe, and that these events, which almost never happen, as rare as they are relatively speaking in terms of cause of death in America, they almost never happen in our peer nations. So what is going on?
I mean, they do happen in peer nations. I was reading about a mass shooting in Eastern Europe the other day. I mean, they do happen. They're not totally...
Right. They're nowhere near the frequencies that are happening in the United States of America.
Well, again, the overall, I agree with you on the overall gun death rate. Obviously, far higher here because we have way more guns. The mass violence episode, again, they're not so frequent. It's hard to even compare them, and they're difficult to. And it's difficult, I think, to construct a policy that would further reduce them. We could reduce gun homicides in general, probably, if we more strictly enforced even the laws we do have on the books to prevent felons from having access to. I mean, you were referencing stricter gun laws that some places have, like Chicago, blue states. But if they're not enforcing that, if they're not actually like arresting and keeping in prison people who have illegal firearms, then it's not going to do any good.
Well, some people have pointed to whether or not there's more that can be discerned from Garcia's background. I think this was from a CNN report that the shooter was removed from the Army over some mental health concerns, that he's been suspected of this right-wing extremist ideology. We'll find out more about that, obviously. Apparently, Garcia underwent firearms proficiency training for his work as a commissioned security officer. This is according to the Texas Online Private Security Database, which maintains records of these sorts of things. He was approved to work as a security guard in Texas, as I said, as of 2016 through 2020. And none of the companies that were involved in this approval process have so far responded to requests for comment, but they are required to go through background checks before they get their license to be a security guard. You were disqualified if you were dishonorably discharged from the military, or if you committed assault, sexual offenses, burglary, etc. So it's a real black box of who knows what at this point. Some people, conservatives like Ben Shapiro, have seemingly not chosen to contest the kind of implications or the evidence so far that he was right-leaning. Rather, they are looking to other shootings like the Nashville shooting at the Christian school and raising questions about why the media wasn't as interested, in his view, in the background of that.
Right, that manifesto not being released, the assumption being that it probably points to a very anti-Christian, anti-conservative agenda of that shooter. I think that's maybe a fair point, that the media is only interested if this is going to be embarrassing to people on the right. Of course, you could have a general, opposition to probing the ideologies of these kind of people in general, so as to not have contagion.
When I was talking about this, I think Inez was my co-host when that story broke, and in the conservative chair, and her view was that it's not helpful to publish manifestos, that it encourages copycats, and that there's a public safety interest in not doing so. I don't have strong feelings about it one way or the other.
That might be the case, but I mean, the media would have to practice self-responsibility to not do that, because obviously you can't have any policy that prevents the media from covering these things if they want to. I mean, it's a free speech issue. Yeah,
I mean, I presume that in this instance, it's that the manifesto hasn't been released, that it's in the custody of police or the family or whatever, and that they just haven't made it public. And that's a choice. I personally, for the record, would not object to seeing the Christian school shooters manifesto for ideological reasons. I'm not, as a leftist, my ideology has nothing to do with what this
I don't really like the idea that we have to keep the public safe from encountering information. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Which is sort of the idea behind that. Don't even publish the manifesto. Look, I don't think that we should count that stuff as very interesting. Again, people kill each other for all sorts of reasons, sometimes ideological, sometimes not. And it is very, I think, human to try to look for meaning in that. What was he thinking? Where did he go wrong? How does his ideas add up? And that's a human tendency, but I think we're often looking for meaning where there is none.
Perhaps. I just find it a little bit interesting. Like, I wouldn't object to some left-wing shooters' reasoning being made public, because whatever they're thinking is obviously not mine, because I don't believe in murdering people.
Right.
It's interesting to me, like, why would someone object to, if we discover that this person in fact does have this, white supremacist right-wing ideology, if you're not a white supremacist right-wing person who supports in murdering children at the mall, then why does that reflect negatively on you in the least? Unless you've been saying things about the Great Replacement theory and things that are,
it's almost like it's treated as more legitimate if the manifesto says, there's too many black and brown people in this country or something, and this is my ideology. People say, like, that's more coherent or something than I hear voices in my head and I think everyone's an alien around me, so I'm going to start shooting them. But if you're shooting people for either of these reasons, it's equally incoherent. It's not a philosophy. It's not legitimate. It's you're crazy. And we should stop ascribing.
Well, I would argue that it's not about legitimacy. If someone is crazy and they think there's aliens, well, there's no aliens, probably. Right. So there's nothing any of us can do about that. If someone is watching programming and reading, blogs or going down Reddit rabbit holes or whatever it is, where they are being told that the problems in their life are attributable to Black people or brown people or Jewish people, and they are acting on the information that's being promulgated, sometimes by some pretty high-profile media figures, then the question is whether there should be more pushback against the messaging that has a more tangible relationship to someone's actions, in a way that no one can blame an alien that doesn't exist, or a mental health disorder or voice in the head that no one can identify for causing someone to shoot.
But the messaging at the highest level is never, ever go kill people. So that's on them. And
Robby,
probably, and I mean, this is the argument that people who are inclined toward that or capable of that are unwell. It's not normal, and it's not going to be a specific ideology that sends them that way.
Regrettably, the argument that people make is that history has shown that oftentimes acts of mass killing, genocide, pogroms against, whether it's ethnic minorities or religious minorities or what have you, start by dehumanizing them, making it easier, the threshold for killing them or incarcerating them or putting them in an internment camp or putting them in a gulag or a concentration camp. The threshold is lower the more that we talk about them as less than human. And so it wasn't overnight. I don't mean to make everything about World War II and the Holocaust, obviously, but it wasn't overnight that you just start shipping people on trains. It's not overnight that you lock up Japanese people during World War II. These things happen gradually. There's movies like District 9. I mean, there's all these dystopian horror films where we see how you start to talk about people like bugs. You start to talk about people like something other than being human beings. And so, yes, there are people who are always going to be more incentivized or more inclined to, I think, take the life of another. And there are others who are never going to actively put the gun to, the Jewish person's head. And, but there are people who are on the borderline and who feel empowered by the state, by media, by other kinds of forces to dehumanize others and start to cross that line.
I understand that theory, and I think that's
difficult.
Right,
and you can't prove it.
Right, and I think that's obviously you're describing a phenomenon that's real for national policy, for state-sanctioned violence, for all of those things. For the crazy person who does a thing like this, I don't know.
Would it bother you if in a manifesto someone specifically said, I listened to The Hill. I watched The Rising. I don't want to make it personal, but I'm trying not to make it about any one person, so I thought we could make it about ourselves. But, if someone said, I watched Sesame Street and Big Bird told me to do this, and you go back to an episode.
I just think they were crazy, because, unless Big Bird literally said, go shoot people for...
It's not Big Bird, but there are people who are saying... The immigrants are killing people. The immigrants are taking your jobs. The immigrants are causing all the crime. Black people are inherently violent. Black people are doing all the crime.
Well, if they're just, I would criticize if commentators are making inaccurate comments,
Yeah.
I would just criticize those comments for being inaccurate.
All right. Well, it's interesting. I think it's very fraught because the one-to-one relationship isn't one-to-one, but I think it would be difficult to deny the influence on certain potentially fragile, pre-existing condition type people to follow the lead of folks who are in positions of authority. And what do we do about that as a society, respecting free speech interests and the like? It's not entirely clear to me, but I do think it's worth a conversation. I appreciate you starting it with me here today, Robby, and of course we'll have more Rising for you right after this.